As Lane mentioned in the previous session, the crisis of capitalism is particularly acute in the ex-colonial world. So when we look at news today, when you scroll, it's impossible to not see the enormous human suffering that capitalism inflicts upon millions of people in the ex-colonial countries. So what we see is endless conflict, genocide, poverty, oppression, inequality. And for anyone who genuinely wants to understand why this is the case and wants to study the history, it will become clear that the responsibility mainly lies with Western imperialist powers and the bloody legacy of colonialism. So in recent years, it has become quite common for activist groups, especially in universities, to increasingly describe themselves as decolonial or anti-colonial, or talk about the need to decolonize different things, like decolonize your campus, decolonize your bookshelf, decolonize your mind even, and so on and so forth. So there are many different labels and slogans that have a similar tone that I'm sure people here have heard before, but the main premises of all these different ideas come from a single theoretical origin, and that is postcolonialism, which is the subject of our discussion today. So today on the left, these ideas are relatively popular, I would say, particularly among a layer of radical youth who believe that we need a vocabulary of our own to essentially signal our commitment to fight imperialism and fight racism. And I'd argue that this is a very understandable feeling today, especially when you look at bourgeois media. We're constantly bombarded with this barrage of propaganda by Western politicians, journalists who display the most disgusting hypocrisy and arrogance when they talk about the rest of the world. So I'm sure everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about, but just look at how they're talking about Palestinians and how they're talking about Iranians like they're savages, they're religious fanatics, and Israel is some kind of outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East. Here too, they demonize immigrants from countries in Latin America or South Asia, resorting to all sorts of racist arguments, or generally how they portray kind of people in poor countries dominated by imperialism as somehow being lazy or incompetent. For some reason they can't figure it out, and so on and so forth. This list goes on forever. But I think in all of this, they always rely in some shape or form on this idea that the West is somehow different and better, actually, than the rest of the world, not because of imperialism or anything, but because of Western culture and Western values. So a country like Canada, for example, simply has a cultural preference for having things like democracy, peace, and human rights, while other nations, because of their culture, choose to have dictatorships, violent conflict, bigotry. I mean, this is obviously racist nonsense. But not only that, it is nonsense that was quite literally, systematically turned into a theory in 1993 by American political scientist Samuel P. Huntington. So this was after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the ruling class was celebrating the end of history, since communism was now a dead dog, essentially. And the free market would now surely lead humanity to a future of guaranteed peace and prosperity. And of course, this celebration was very short-lived because new crises and conflicts soon began, especially in the so-called developing world. So Huntington argued, while communism was defeated, this did not mean Western liberal democracy would now become a universal value, like people like Francis Fukuyama had first seen, for example, because according to Huntington, humanity was inherently divided into multiple civilizations based on their religion and culture. So what was now inevitable was a clash of civilizations, in which, he argued, Western values would always be under threat from others, especially from Islam. So not surprisingly, this so-called thesis was used to justify criminal wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and I think more generally for the last 30 years, this has been the dominant ideology of Western imperialism. So constantly exposed to this sort of propaganda, many people, I think, intuitively understand that the struggle against imperialism is not just a political or economic one, but it is an ideological one as well. And this is true, but in order to fight imperialist propaganda, we actually need to have correct ideas ourselves. So for some people, postcolonialism appears to be the answer in this regard. So as Marxists, we unconditionally stand against all forms of oppression, whether that's national, religious, or racial. So at first glance, it may seem logical that we simply identify ourselves as decolonial or post-colonial Marxists, as some people have done. But the thing is, Marxism is not just about how we identify, it's a method. It is a method that bases itself on a scientific understanding of the world. So this means we actually have a responsibility to have a meticulous approach towards different ideas that we encounter in the movement. So if calling ourselves decolonial only meant fighting against imperialism or for genuine equality, then I think we would agree, no doubt about it. But as I will explain in this lead-off, these ideas not only do not really help us understand what imperialism actually is or where oppression really comes from, but their practical application will actually lead us to outright reactionary positions. So where did postcolonialism come from? So postcolonial theory first developed in the 1980s within the literature departments of several, mainly American and some British universities. So this was part of a general trend in academia that some comrades might be familiar with, especially in the West, towards ideas more closely aligned with postmodernism, with a rejection of objective truth and an emphasis on culture and narratives. And as you may know, again, this was a period of general decline in the class struggle, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this really caused a wave of pessimism on the left, leading many left-leaning academics to essentially abandon Marxism. So in the realm of studying the former colonial world, this shift from class politics to culture and narratives essentially expressed itself in the rise of postcolonialism. So one of the foundational texts of the post-colonial canon, if you will, is undoubtedly the book Orientalism by Edward Said. So I'm sure some of you have heard of it. And I think in order to understand some of the philosophical premises of post-colonialism, it is worthwhile to look at some of the theses of this book because it's so influential. So in the book, Said mainly analyzes how Western academia historically portrayed the Orient. And by that, he's referring to the Middle East mostly. Or more specifically, he criticizes Orientalists, so Western academics, from the 19th and early 20th centuries for using racist stereotypes and crude generalizations, depicting Muslims as barbaric, backward, and irrational people, all under the guise of scholarly objectivity. He then shows how these depictions contributed to this idea in the West that the Middle East was incapable of self-rule and had to be governed by Europeans, essentially justifying colonialism. And Said does make clear that although today colonial rule may be over, this attitude still persists in Western society and academia. And I think when we look at things like this theory of clash of civilizations, it is absolutely true. The thing is, this is not all Said says in this book, actually far from it. So in the book, he also describes how these racist ideas about the East were reproduced, not just in academic texts, but in Western literature as well, in poems, novels, giving examples of writers like Kipling, Gustave Flaubert. And for Said, these examples are enough to show that Western culture, all of Western culture, had become, in his words, tinged and impressed with colonialism. So therefore, he concludes, every European, in what he could say about the Orient, was a racist, was an imperialist, and almost totally ethnocentric. So this is a dramatic generalization from what has been put, especially when we notice that he's not simply saying what Europeans concretely had said during this period was racist. He is arguing that anything they could possibly say would inevitably be racist. So in other words, any idea from Europe, regardless of its content, could never really truly describe or understand the East and could only really be detrimental to it. So he just like that, he brushes off an entire continent as one reactionary cultural bloc. On this note, he actually specifically attacks Karl Marx about his writings on India, which I will come back to later, saying that while Marx may have explicitly opposed colonialism, his theories could only base themselves on Orientalist generalizations, simply because Marx was European. So what's interesting is, for Said, being European or being a Westerner more generally is defined as belonging to a power with definite interest in the Orient. So yeah, I know I see some confusion, but in other words, a connection to imperialism is what makes someone a Westerner in the first place. So of course it follows that all Westerners are imperialists, because imperialists are, by his own definition, are Westerners. So the snake eats its own tail. But he also adds that this Western culture, on that, he argues that it has been prejudiced against the East since the time of Homer. which is a very bold claim to make, but he does not explain this at all, but just says Homer wrote about the East in the Iliad, presumably meaning Trojans. It's not really explained. But just from this, Said basically concludes that imperialism is a transhistorically Western cultural trait, meaning this eternal Western culture has always been racist and therefore will always be racist. So all of this is based on fairly unsound methodology, but I think Said goes even further on this point. So I hope you'll follow this, but for him, Orientalism is not just about collection of false racist information or lies about the Middle East that people like Marx, for example, could discern to be not true or overcome by studying the correct information. No. For Said, what the Orientalists produced was what he calls a system of truth. So a fictional construct called the Orient, which became the only thing a Westerner could see when they look at the Orient because of their culture. So they cannot know the real geographical Middle East as it exists, the East in itself, to use a Kantian term, but they are conditioned because of their culture to see the East as inferior and needing of Western intervention. And ultimately, this is the conclusion of it, for Said, this culture is what causes imperialism. So he believes that texts produced by prestigious academic institutions, and I quote, create not only knowledge, but also the very reality they appear to describe. So if the literature and culture of a society is imperialistic, this will create the reality of imperialism. So I think this is a crystal clear example of the idealist method, which sees ideas as the driving force of history. So the logic becomes, if we want to change society, if we want to change history, we need to first change culture, language, representation, since these things not only influence, but actually actively construct our reality. So this is ultimately what is meant by decolonizing your mind. Although we may no longer live under colonial rule, there is a colonial rule in your head, in your mind, created by racist or imperialist culture that we must constantly resist. Whether we can ever fully rid ourselves from this colonial rule in our mind, it's a question I'll come back to later, but we can't. That's I'll say that. Yeah, I know, spoiled it a bit. But sorry. As Marxists, we are materialists. What does that mean? So we understand that culture, art, tradition, they do play a very important role in society, in politics, but these are ultimately determined by the material reality of class struggle and the development of the productive forces. So every ideology throughout history has a material foundation in the outlook or the interests of a particular layer or class in society. So racist or colonialist ideas are not just the result of some inborn evil of Europeans, but they actually arise from the development of capitalism and the corresponding changes in the interests of the ruling class. So in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels explain that once capital saturates the domestic market, it is forced to go beyond the borders of the nation state and spread across the world. This is the real material basis of imperialism. And the history of colonialism cannot be understood as separate from this. So similarly, racism and its development by the institutions of the ruling class that Said describes, this represents the political dimension of the same process. So racism is an essential tool for the bourgeoisie, not just to ideologically justify imperialism, but also to persuade workers that they share more in common with their own ruling class than they do with the workers and oppressed around the world. This is the main purpose of propaganda, like Clash of Civilizations, to portray humanity as inherently divided and to suggest that Western society must defend its values globally for everyone's benefit. You know, when in reality, this defense of values always conveniently corresponds to the material interests of the imperialists. So we need to expose this at every chance that we get. Take the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, for example. Millions of people of every race, culture, and religion have shown their support for the Palestinian cause, despite the efforts of the ruling class to constantly demonize Palestinians as terrorists and religious fanatics. But when you think about it, this is the same ruling class in the West that has funded and supported the most reactionary Islamic fundamentalists across the globe, calling them allies, democrats, even freedom fighters. We've seen it in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in Libya, Iraq, most recently in Syria. The ruling class has no qualms allying itself with reactionary forces around the globe, no matter from which culture or religion. They don't care about this, you know. What they are against is international working class solidarity. But rather than challenging this premise of imperialists, postcolonialism accepts it. It agrees that we are irreconcilably divided and that European culture is somehow exceptional in its tendency to dominate everything else. So, of course, they don't present this as a good thing, obviously, but the framework remains the same. Imperialism is framed not as a struggle between classes, but as a clash between cultures. So, let's go a bit deeper, I think, on the philosophy aspect of it. If culture is indeed essential in understanding imperialism, then we must ask, okay, what determines this culture in the first place? So, for postcolonialists, culture is not something that arises from the material realities of life, but it is actually a product of what they call discourse. So, discourse roughly means, in this setting, ideas, language, and representations that are dominant in society. So then, what determines this dominant discourse? So for all strains of postmodern thought, including postcolonial theory, the answer is power. So as Marxists, when we hear power, we may think state power, or more generally, the power of one class over another. But for postmodernists, power is not something that can be possessed by an individual or group. It is actually something that permeates every dimension, every aspect of life. And it manifests itself in social norms, in language, in institutions, religion, tradition, in this lead-off that I'm giving. And it is this omnipresent entity that produces discourse. So it means it defines our ways of thinking and our ways of speaking about things. That's what power does. So in return, these ways of thinking will determine what we accept as true or false. So basically, what constitutes knowledge. So for postmodernists, knowledge is subjective and it is determined by power. It is not a measure of our understanding of a real existing world, but it is precisely the illusion of truth, illusion of an objective truth. So in the end, it is this illusion that upholds and reinforces power. Have I lost you yet? I don't know. But so this is an idea taken directly from French post-structuralist Michel Foucault. And it is reproduced almost exactly by post-colonialists. So basically the premise is the West has power because Eurocentric knowledge reinforces it. We know the West to be powerful. But the only reason it is able to produce this knowledge is because it has power. Another snake eating its tail. But it's a complete tautology that explains nothing about the history of the world or who actually has power in society. But that's kind of the point. If we believe that all knowledge is subjective, nothing can really be known, then, yeah, with no objective reality, we cannot test the correctness of different ideas by seeing how well they correspond to the real world. So any idea is as true as any other. There can be no development of thought, and above all, there can be no such thing as progress. And this is another key feature of postcolonialism. It fervently rejects the idea of historical progress. And along with it, it rejects the idea that there can be more advanced or more backward societies, ideas, practices, because for them, every society or tradition is a narrative, right? So no narrative can represent an improvement over another. So on this question, they take an extremely moralistic stance, actually, saying that the idea of progress itself is a Eurocentric project that aims to legitimize colonialism. So often, in their effort to critique the destruction that capitalism has brought to the colonial world, they also reject all of its progressive aspects. So often, this leads them to actually corner themselves into the deeply, deeply reactionary positions. And I'll give you a good example of this. It comes from post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak, that some of you may know. She's quite a big name of post-colonialism. So in one of her essays, she actually talks about something called sati, which was a religious practice in India where widows were burnt alive on their husband's funeral pyre. I know, quite brutal. So sati was outlawed in 1829 under the British colonial rule, and according to Spivak, this entrenched the narrative of the civilized West against the barbaric East, or as she calls it, a narrative of white men saving brown women. And she argues that in the debates that took place about sati, there was no honest representation of Indian women, meaning we have no way of knowing how they may have thought about all of this. I have an idea how they may have thought about this. But she basically agrees that widow burning, yes, she agrees that this was a patriarchal tradition, true, but then she goes on to say its abolition was itself a form of epistemic violence because it allowed colonial discourse to define Indian tradition as backwards. So in other words, ending the practice of burning widows, let's remember that, was not progress, and to consider it such would be participating in colonial discourse. So this is an extremely reactionary conclusion that Spivak only makes because when she looks at sati, she only sees a narrative. It's like what another French post-structuralist, Jacques Derrida, said, there's nothing outside the text. And for Spivak too, there is no truth to sati except for what was said or written about it. So she cannot approach it like a real practice involving women made of flesh and blood who can burn and feel pain. But for her, it's a discursive battlefield between a colonial narrative and a patriarchal narrative, both equally violent, without considering what material social conditions these narratives base themselves on. So Spivak reassures us that she is obviously not advocating the killing of widows, which is, to be perfectly honest, major relief when you get to that part of the text. Because she says obviously, but I would argue this is not obvious at all. Because when you think about it, the post-colonial approach dictates that we cannot say widow burning was a backwards tradition, because this would be Eurocentrism, or even worse, pro-colonialism. So we're materialists, meaning we can say with confidence that the abolition of sati, widow burning, was a progress. In fact, I think even more broadly, we would argue that modernization of India out of its pre-capitalist traditional conditions was progress. But this does not mean we think that capitalism is a more morally evolved system. I think that would be a very difficult argument to make today. But the point is, compared to the traditional Indian society, capitalism does represent a higher level of development for the productive forces, meaning society's capacity to be able to meet human needs. This, for Marxists, is the main and objective measure of historical progress. But this process of development is not linear. It actually very often involves very, very contradictory processes. So like I mentioned, Marx actually wrote a considerable amount about British colonial rule in India, which he described as the inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization unveiled. So far from supporting them, he found the actions of the British to be repugnant. They caused enormous pain and suffering in India by completely destroying the balance of traditional economic life in order to extract the maximum amount of wealth as ruthlessly as possible. And yet, the economic system that capitalism uprooted in India, objectively speaking, was extremely backwards. For most people, for a vast majority of the population, this traditional economy involved an isolated existence in small villages, marked by sharp caste distinctions, slavery, and the heavy influence of religion and patriarchy, as seen in practices like widow burning. And the economy was very limited, largely relying on domestic production. And the traditional ruling elites of India lacked the will or the ability to develop it further. And this lower economic level, by the way, is the explanation as to how the British were able to subdue Indians in the first place, not because of some inherent European drive or power to dominate, as both colonialists and post-colonials seem to suggest, but because Britain had developed a more advanced economic system. So Marx explained, by bringing capitalism to India, the British inadvertently caused a social revolution because they united the country, they developed means of transport and communication, introduced free press, and at least for a slim layer of the population, introduced education and sciences, etc. And they did not do any of these things out of the goodness of their heart, but to serve their own capitalist interests by developing an Indian market. But as Marx says, as an unconscious tool of history, they nonetheless paved the way for further social progress. Does this mean that Marx saw colonialism as some benevolent power, like post-colonialists insist that he did? No, he actually made it abundantly clear that imperialism was only laying down the material conditions for a new future society, but this society could only be realized by the Indian people themselves on the condition that they won liberation from imperialist rule. So much like the bourgeoisie in Europe, imperialism was also creating its own gravediggers. And this is the historical materialist account of the social development that occurred in India under British colonial rule. But without understanding this general process, it's not possible to understand individual phenomena like the abolition of sati. For post-colonialists, this Marxist conception of history is completely unacceptable, because for them, history cannot exist independently of our thoughts, morals, and feelings. There can be no truth about it, or an objective measure, only words and perspectives. So they're not only hostile to the notion of modernization, they're actually hostile to modernization itself, which they see as the domination of what they call modernity. And for them, modernity is not an objective process, but it is a specific epistemic project shaped by Eurocentrism, and it needs to be rejected. So in this view, capitalism is no more progressive than pre-capitalist formations that it replaced, which, by the way, necessarily means that socialism can be no more progressive than capitalism. And it is actually often from this specific angle that they will attack Marxists, that would presume to know what is a better kind of society, when there is no such thing as knowing or better, or society even. And I think a really good example of this brand of paralyzing sophistry, maybe, let's go with that, is Dipesh Chakrabarti, who's another major name of post-colonial theory. I think some people may have read something, I'm sorry about that. But okay, so Chakrabarti argues that historical materialism, or historicism, as he calls it, is totalizing and Eurocentric because it fails to consider the plurality of the world. So in his book, Provincializing Europe, he argues that capitalism, as a framework developed by Marx, does not apply to India because, simply put, Indian society is religious. So he says, for most Hindus, gods, spirits, and the so-called supernatural have a certain reality. They are as real as ideology and are embedded in practices. So in a typical subjective idealist fashion, he declares, because some people believe in gods and spirits, in their reality, gods and spirits are real. So to use a secular method, like Marxism, for example, to understand these people, their conditions, would be Eurocentrism. In fact, any secular method or worldview would be Eurocentrism. He continues to explain that for most Indians, labor is not a secular activity, but it entails rituals that invoke divine or superhuman presence. So labor for Indian workers, according to him, is not abstract or alienated labor like Marx described, but it is sacred, so it cannot be explained by Marxism. By the way, what a tailor-made argument for Indian bosses. Wage labor is not exploitative for Hindus, it's sacred, But anyway, Chakrabarti continues from here. He says that a deterministic view of historical progress would require that we view time as linear, with things happening one after another. But he says that this secular temporality, time as we experience it, cannot be used to understand Indian society. He does not explain this at all, by the way, but it is implied that it is because Hindus see or experience time as cyclical. But he later continues, if we do see time in these units of godless, spiritless time, this could only be because we belong to a mode of being in the world that is aligned with the principle of disenchantment. So by disenchantment, he means a scientific understanding of the world stripped of magic and mysticism by the ideas of modernity. So he concludes, but disenchantment is not the only principle by which we world the earth. The supernatural can inhabit the world in these other modes of worlding, and not always as a problem or result of conscious belief or ideas. So in summary, everyone worlds their earth differently. The supernatural is as true as science, and if you don't believe in magic or spirits, it's because our minds have been disenchanted by capitalism and modernity. So not only are we not able to argue that workers of different cultures belong to the same class without being Eurocentric, we cannot even say that they inhabit the same world. So this is what he means, by the way, by plurality of the world, that there are indeed multiple worlds, and the same laws of society, or same laws of nature even, do not apply everywhere or to everyone. So physics, biological evolution, modern medicine, these are just questionable narratives of modernity. So in the final analysis, this is what postcolonialism boils down to. It's a hostility to science, to progress, and effectively to class struggle, and a fetishization of backwardness, obscurantism, and yes, religion. So in the name of giving agency to colonize or formerly colonized people, postcolonialism actually reduces them to their traditions. To the struggle, so the struggle against imperialism once again becomes nothing but a defense of these traditions against the Western ideological onslaught. In other words, a clash of civilizations. And this is really, I think, a slap in the face of the nameless millions of workers, peasants, and oppressed who launched wave after wave of revolutionary struggles in the colonial world to fight for a better for better material conditions. You know, as a more recent example, take what happened in Kenya last summer, the Gen Z revolution. Hundreds of thousands of Kenyans marched the streets for weeks against austerity measures, resisted police brutality, and they did not do this to return to some pre-capitalist Africa. They didn't do it for religious reasons or some tribal, traditional reasons. Just think about it. Over 85% of Kenyans identify themselves as religious, but the movement actually overtook churches, mosques to shame the clergy for their complicity with the government. The Gen Z protests also openly identify itself as tribeless, which is actually a historic first in the post-independence history of Kenya. So there are at least 42 ethnic groups in Kenya, but the revolution cut across all of that. What the Kenyans were demanding were better living standards for democracy, access to good education, to healthcare, all of which are arguably notions of modernity according to postcolonialists. So with their logic, Kenyans took the poison pill of modernity and were brainwashed to think that they should fight or even desire these things. Of course, postcolonialism never explicitly says that, because it's not a theory that can engage meaningfully with the real world and provide real solutions. It's so consumed by how Western discourse, especially academic discourse, depicts traditions of developing countries. It actually pays zero attention to the real events that take place in these countries. And the blind emphasis on culture and representation actually necessarily ends up with the proposed solution of changing who gets to write about the third world by replacing authors, university faculties with non-Western academics. This does not reflect the outlook of a revolutionary who wants to dismantle imperialism. This reflects the ambition of petty bourgeois academics who want prestige and promotions. And I think from here, we see very clearly the theoretical deadweight that lies beneath slogans like decolonize your curriculum or decolonize your bookshelf. And there is another idea that is quite common, I would say, among certain proponents of postcolonialism, which is that these ideas, even if they're not perfect, are still nonetheless new ideas. So they're still an improvement over the ideas of dead white men, you know, as they say. Of course, the irony, the big irony here is that postcolonialism itself is a carbon copy of French post-structuralism and European postmodernism, which itself is a crude repetition, actually, of even older European subjective idealists like Immanuel Kant, Bishop Berkeley, David Hume, so other dead white men whose ideas all have been surpassed by Marxism. So we need to be very, very clear that none of these ideas are new. What they represent is not some development in philosophy, but actually a regression. But related on this note of searching for new ideas, in the early 2000s, there was actually a rift within academia in these circles. A new tendency, mainly of Latin American academics, emerged criticizing postcolonialism for being excessively theoretical and apolitical, culminating in what was called the decolonial turn. So decolonial academics opposed the name post-colonialism, the post part, because for them, the goal is not to theorize about a colonialism of the past, but to transform society in a way that ends Western domination. So for that, we need more radical ideas and a political program. So far, so good, actually. But unfortunately, basing itself on the exact same philosophical framework, this decolonial turn also actually leads us off a cliff. Because the solution that was declared was to decolonize post-colonial studies. which meant de-link completely from Western canon. So from Foucault and Derrida, yes, but also from Aristotle, from Marx, from Habermas, all of it, in search of new ideas. The problem with postcolonialism is not that they base themselves on Western philosophy, it's that they base themselves on the worst kind of Western philosophy, subjective idealism. So what are these new ideas that they're proposing? Seems to be nothing, but I guess to summarize, the decolonial answer seems to be basically anything that breaks with modernity, rejects the idea of one truth, and embraces pluriversal thinking. So it's the same thing, and then they argue the act of, like the mere act of connecting and reconnecting with these ideas itself is what will create a new and better society. And through a radical praxis of fostering a decolonial way of thinking, living, doing, sensing, we will reach this society. So I think here we see kind of the theory behind the laundry list of things we can decolonize, like our minds, our diet, I think it was mentioned, our fashion, our relationships, our backyards, all of which are real Google answers that I found when I was searching this. But we have to be honest, like all of this is basically a decolonial whack-a-mole with no moles. Nothing of substance is actually being proposed here. So what kind of political program can even be drawn from these ideas? So Enrique Dussel, who's a major figure in decolonial turn, he actually very explicitly says about like the decolonial approach, we're not going to take steps in a revolutionary way to change the world overnight, like Lenin or like Fidel Castro. The subjective change of people takes decades. We have to create a democratic culture, but it will not be socialist. It will be something else, but neither capitalist nor Eurocentric. So he criticizes Lenin and Castro for not changing the way people think before doing such rash things as revolutions. So we can assume that instead of solving, for example, the land problem in Cuba by expropriating the largest states, redistributing land, Dussel would prefer the subjective change of convincing these landlords about decolonizing their thinking about land and how they relate to it or something. Obviously, this is a comical level of idealism. But he continues, actually, saying that their plan is not a far-left one that aims to overthrow the state. Decolonials here actually argue that we need to strengthen the state to provide food, healthcare, and defense of interests against imperialism. And then we can occupy the state and interrupt political forms of domination. So in short, what they're saying is we cannot get rid of the bourgeois state, but rather we should strengthen it and take it from within. These are the central theses of run-of-the-mill reformism. The only decolonial twist here is that we can use the state to change Eurocentric narrative. So it's no wonder that everywhere in Latin America they've upheld different reformists who paid lip service to anti-imperialism or indigenous sovereignty in words, like Evo Morales and Mas in Bolivia, AMLO in Mexico, on the grounds that they supposedly broke with Eurocentric paradigms, providing them with radical credentials despite their pro-capitalist policies. So although opposed to capitalism in words, the colonials have no interest in actually fighting it. What they envision is a sort of cultural revolution that will help us transcend modernity until we end up with what some of them call a transmodern communal state. Once again, we don't know what this means, how to get there. And I think Ramon Grosfoguel, who's another decolonial, gives the most honest, I think, summary of the decolonial outlook towards this transmodern communal state. He says, this utopia will never be fully realized. But it serves as a compass. Although today we're in such a reality that makes us very pessimistic, we must leave open the possibility and see what happens in the coming centuries. Voila, yeah. So just sit tight, change the way you think, and wait for a couple centuries. So imagine a Bolivian miner in Potosi who wakes up in the morning, free of all Eurocentric ideas, completely decolonized in his thinking about the world after having read all of this wisdom, obviously. Whether it's in his new worldview or not, he has to go back to the mine, produce profits for his boss and the Canadian multinational that probably owns that mine. What awaits him otherwise is either starvation or homelessness. But the best decolonial theory can offer is patience for a few centuries while they redefine paradigms or whatever they do. The idea that power and exploitation lie not in property relations, but in Eurocentric epistemes can only make sense in the ivory tower of academia. So we need to be very clear that these ideas are wholly incompatible with revolutionary communism and reject any attempt to reconcile them. How am I doing? So, running out of time, but I think before we conclude, there is one more theory that I think we need to at least briefly touch on, given our context in Canada, which is the theory of settler colonialism. It is really like an extension of postcolonialism which developed in countries like Australia and Canada, actually, where historically the native population was largely replaced by European settlers during the colonial period, and historically speaking, there was no decolonization, so to speak. So as a theory, this settler colonialism differs a little bit, actually, from other strains of postcolonialism, in that it is actually forced to theorize more concretely about the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, indigenous and non-indigenous people. So I think for our purposes today, it actually reveals another dimension of the weakness of some of these theories. So of course it can be a discussion completely on its own right, but I think there's some broad lessons that we can draw from it, because basing itself on the exact same subjective idealist method, the main premise of settler colonialism is that the main division that exists in society is between indigenous people and settlers, and not between classes. Or as one academic actually presents it, what we have is a dictatorship of the settlers as opposed to what Marxists call a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So the implied solution here is that the settlers would need to be overthrown from their position of power as they have diametrically opposing interests to the indigenous population. The implication is that settlers actively benefit from the continued subjugation of indigenous people, so the focus should not be class struggle, but the struggle of indigenous people against settlers as a whole. So all practical conclusions revolve around some of the crudest forms of identity politics. And perhaps the most influential text, at least in recent period of this theory, is the article "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor" by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, where they emphasize that decolonization is not about words and gestures, but about repatriation of all land to indigenous people. Yet, we're never actually told what this means or what it should look like. For example, in Canada, indigenous people make up less than 5% of the population. Do they become proprietors of all land, or do we communalize the land? If yes, how do we actually go about it? What is the method by which we reach this conclusion? And the authors explicitly actually do not provide a concrete program and say that the answers will reveal themselves with time, but they still make sure to conclude that whatever the answers will be, they will not emerge from friendly understanding, meaning we cannot work together in the meantime towards this goal, because as they explain, and I quote, "The uncommonality between indigenous and non-indigenous people uncoalesces coalition politics." So their main argument is that what will benefit indigenous people will necessarily have to hurt and hinder all the other people. So for example, they argue that the pursuit of workers' rights in a settler colonial context is still pro-colonial, because the sheer idea of redistribution of wealth camouflages how much of that wealth comes from native land. And because they conceptualize land as a spiritual concept, as an idea, they're actually firmly opposed to communism, explaining that both Marxists and capitalists view land and natural resources as commodities to be exploited, by capitalists for personal gain, and by Marxists for the good of all. The horror. But from their subjective idealist perspective, this makes perfect sense, because there can be no such thing as good of all, given indigenous people and non-indigenous people are inherently different, so they cannot possibly want the same things. They argue that any movement that truly aspires to decolonization has to, and I quote, "impoverish and not enrich the settler population." So here, decolonization, as they conceptualize it, implies a transfer of wealth from non-indigenous people, regardless of their class, to indigenous people. But how do we convince people to actually do this? And the authors actually bring up this question themselves. How do we do it? But they only indignantly say decolonization is not accountable to settlers or settler futurity, and leave it there to make a point. And I think it's because I've read quite a lot of these texts, and I think it's completely understandable and human, no matter who you are, by the way, what identity you come from, to be outraged and pained and angry by the history of mass genocide and dispossession that colonialism wrought on indigenous people across the globe. But emotional outrage and pain alone, they do not make a good theory, and they certainly do not make a good political program. Just think about it. In Canada, how can indigenous people alone, by themselves, defeat this reactionary bloc of tens of millions of settlers out there? Like, this is the definition of pessimism. And the result is decolonization as a broad slogan is indeed just a metaphor, despite what the title of this article is. And I think here we arrive at a general truth about all post-colonial theory, no matter under which name it comes. It is not equipped to deal with the real world and cannot actually go beyond abstractions and moral declarations. The result is radical-sounding verbiage trickling down to young people in universities that only serves to divide the movement to its individual parts, weaken it, and condemn it to isolation and defeat, which ultimately aligns with the interests of the ruling class. So, to conclude, I hope I've been able to at least begin to demonstrate how these ideas represent a complete dead end for anyone who genuinely wants to fight for a better kind of world. Post-colonial academics, when you think about it, are actually incapable of showing us a way forward, because when you look at it, for all their talk about decolonization and liberation, they actually cannot even explain the essence of all the real heroic anti-colonial struggles that took place in the 20th century, because they frame these struggles as being against modernity, accepting without question yet another piece of imperialist propaganda, which is that imperialism aimed and continues to aim the modernization of the world. This is completely false. Yes, at its birth in Europe, capitalism was a progressive force that swept away backwardness, obscurantism of feudal society. But in the epoch of imperialism, this has completely turned into its opposite. It is a straitjacket for further development. So when we look at the development of things like democracy, industrialization, modernization in the former colonies, we see that it was the masses themselves who time and time again attempted to push society forward out of the barbarism and backwardness that imperialism posed upon it. It was imperialists who rested on all that is rotten and reactionary and old, like tribalism, sectarianism, religious fundamentalism, to essentially divide and conquer. But post-colonialists see these reactionary things today as resistance to Eurocentric modernity and attack what was once progressive about capitalism, which, by the way, happens to be precisely the things that capitalism cannot offer us anymore. So in all of this, post-colonialists end up being fully aligned with the imperialists. That is ultimately why their ideas are being promoted in universities across the world today, because they're not a threat to the system. Their real struggle becomes against Marxism and against the working class. So as Marxists, we understand that imperialism is not some policy enacted by Orientalist or Eurocentric politicians, but in Lenin's words, it is the highest stage of capitalism, meaning its driving force is not culture, discourse, or epistemes, but the material interest of the capitalist ruling class. So on the basis of this economic system, there is no way out of this current crisis, neither in the ex-colonial countries nor in the West. So stated quite plainly, the only way to decisively smash imperialism on a global scale is to take power and wealth out of the hands of this parasitic minority and fight for socialism internationally. This is what communists stand for. And to do this, we must reject any theory that attempts to divide the working class along national, racial, religious, or cultural lines. Because workers all over the world have far more in common with each other than they do with any imperialist or any capitalist. You know, in the advanced capitalist countries, like here in Canada, our role as communists is to show the ruling class that wages war, oppresses other nations, is the same ruling class responsible for austerity, unemployment, and the repression here at home. So the struggle of the oppressed against imperialism, no matter where in the world, is our struggle. So the defeat of imperialism anywhere is a victory for the working class everywhere. And this is why we should be proud to raise the banner of internationalism, so that we can build a new world order where people of all cultures, for the first time in history, can relate to each other as genuinely free human beings. Thank you.